Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? We got a ton of requests to dig into the current state of the US economy.
Always a hot topic.
Yeah, so we're going straight to the source for this one, the Federal Reserve's October 2024 Beige Book.
Ah, yes, the Beige Book.
For anyone who might not be familiar with this, it's essentially a collection of anecdotal reports from businesses all across the country.
It's like getting a pulse check on Main Street America.
hmm
Hearing directly from business owners about what they're seeing and experiencing.
Right. It's not just numbers and statistics, it's real stories and observations, and that gives us a much richer understanding of what's actually happening out there.
Exactly. It helps us connect the dots between the big picture economic data and the day-to-day realities of businesses and consumers.
Okay, so let's dive in. What's the overall economic vibe we're getting from this Beige Book? Boom times bust or something in between?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest.
Yeah.
The overall picture is one of slight change. Some areas are up, some are down, but there's this underlying current of uncertainty running through it all.
Uncertainty, huh? What's driving that?
Well, a lot of it stems from the uncertainty surrounding interest rates. They're like the conductor of the economic orchestra, and everyone's waiting to see what tempo they'll set next.
Right. Interest rates impact everything from business loans to mortgages to consumer spending. It's like this big question mark looming over the economy.
Exactly. And that uncertainty can make businesses hesitant to invest and hire, and it can make consumers think twice about making big purchases.
So a bit of a wait and see approach then.
That seems to be the prevailing sentiment right now.
Okay, let's get into some specifics. The Beige Book mentions a slowdown in manufacturing. What's going on there?
Yeah, most districts reported declining manufacturing activity, which isn't entirely surprising given the global economic climate.
Right, we've been hearing a lot about those global trade tensions and how they're impacting American manufacturers.
Exactly. Those tensions can disrupt supply chains, increase costs, and make it harder for U.S. manufacturers to compete in the global market.
The Beige Book actually gives us some real-world examples of this. The Boston district, for instance, reported that certain manufacturers are struggling with weak sales.
It's a tough environment for manufacturers right now.
No kidding. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about consumer spending. How are people feeling about opening their wallets these days?
Well, the reports on consumer spending are mixed. Some districts saw increases, others saw declines. It really depends on the region and the specific industry.
So some folks are spending while others are pulling back. Makes sense. I've definitely noticed myself being more careful at the grocery store lately.
I think a lot of people are feeling that pinch.
Yeah, for sure. Have you noticed yourself changing your spending habits at all?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're all feeling the impact of inflation in one way or another.
For sure. All right, let's talk about housing. This is a topic that always gets a lot of attention.
Did a big one. And it's one that's closely tied to those interest rates we were talking about earlier.
Right, because interest rates directly impact mortgage rates.
Exactly. So when interest rates go up, mortgage rates tend to follow suit, which can make it more expensive for people to buy a home.
And that can have a ripple effect throughout the entire housing market.
Absolutely. So what does the Beige Book have to say about the state of housing?
Well, the report indicates that the housing market is generally stable, at least for now.
Stable, really. I've heard so much back and forth about whether the housing market is booming or about to crash.
I know, right? It's a lot to process. But the Beige Book seems to suggest that things are relatively balanced at the moment. Inventory is expanding, meaning there are more homes available for sale.
Okay, and what about home values? Are they going up, down, or staying flat?
The report says that home values are either holding steady or rising slightly. So no dramatic swings in either direction.
That's good to hear. So it sounds like the housing market isn't experiencing the same kind of volatility that we're seeing in other sectors of the economy.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. However, the Beige Book does mention that mortgage rate uncertainty is making some potential buyers hesitant. They're waiting to see what happens with interest rates before jumping into the market.
That makes sense. It's a big decision to buy a home, and people want to make sure they're getting the best possible deal.
For sure. So that interest rate suspense we talked about earlier is definitely having an impact on the housing market.
Absolutely. And even with this relative stability, it's important to acknowledge the ongoing affordable housing shortage, which is a big problem, particularly for certain communities.
That's a crucial point. It's not just about the overall market. It's about people's ability to find a decent and affordable place to live.
Exactly. Access to safe and affordable housing is essential for individual well-being and for the overall health of our communities.
You know, reading through the Beige Book, I was actually struck by some of the bright spots amidst all this economic uncertainty.
Oh, really? What
Yeah.
caught your eye?
Well, for one, the boom in data center and infrastructure projects in a few districts was pretty surprising. It seems like the tech sector is still pouring in some serious investment.
That's interesting. It suggests that certain sectors of the economy are still seeing strong growth, even amidst all the uncertainty.
Exactly. And then there's Cape Cod's strong summer tourism season. Who knew people were still flocking to the beach amidst all this economic talk?
It's a good reminder that even when things feel shaky, people still crave leisure and travel experiences.
And you know what else surprised me? The dock worker strike didn't cause as much chaos as everyone predicted.
Oh, yeah, I remember all those warnings about supply chain disruptions and potential shortages.
Right. But it seems like things weren't as bad as some feared.
That's good news. The Beige Book says the strike caused just minor temporary disruptions, which is a relief for businesses and consumers alike.
Okay, let's talk about the job market. What's the latest? Are people finding jobs getting laid off, or what?
Well, the Beige Book shows slight overall employment growth. More than half of the districts reported slight or modest gains in employment.
So there are jobs out there.
Yeah, it seems so. But what's interesting is that we're seeing low worker turnover, limited layoffs, and easier worker availability all at the same time.
So companies are holding on to their employees, not laying off many folks, and it's not as hard to hire. That sounds pretty positive.
It is in many ways,
Huh.
but there's a catch. It's still tough to find workers with specific skills, particularly in fields like tech manufacturing and construction. It's like this mismatch between the skills people have and the skills employers need.
Ah, the good old skills gap. We've been hearing about this for years.
And it's still a major challenge for businesses and for the economy as a whole.
I bet that impacts wages too, right?
You bet. Wages are still going up, but at a modest to moderate pace overall.
Okay, so not huge jumps, but still some upward movement.
Yes. But there's a fascinating contrast within that trend. Some workers, especially those in skilled trades or located in remote areas, are seeing larger than usual pay increases. But for others, the gains are much smaller.
So location and specialized skills are playing a bigger role in salary negotiations these days.
It seems that way. The job market is becoming increasingly specialized, and workers with in-demand skills are in a strong position to negotiate higher wages.
That makes sense. I wonder, have you noticed any of these wage trends in your own line of work?
Oh, definitely. It's something that's on everyone's mind these days.
For sure. All right, let's talk about inflation. This is the topic that's been dominating the headlines for months.
The elephant in the room, right?
Exactly. Everyone's worried about prices these days. Are things getting any better?
Well, the good news is that inflation continues to moderate. Selling prices are increasing at a slight to modest pace in most districts.
So things are cooling down a bit on the price front. That's got to be a relief for people.
It is, but it's not a uniform cool down. Some prices like those for certain food products are still jumping up. The report specifically mentions eggs and dairy as examples.
Ugh, tell me about it. My grocery bill is proof of that. It makes you wonder how businesses are navigating this whole situation.
Right. It's a reminder that even as overall inflation moderates, some items can still see big price hikes. And a key factor driving business decisions right now is the fact that consumers are becoming increasingly price sensitive.
Makes sense. If people are watching their budgets more closely, businesses have to be careful about their pricing.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act for them, managing their own costs while remaining competitive in a price-conscious market.
Before we move on, there's one more thing I want to touch on, the regional variations in economic activity.
Yes, the U.S. economy doesn't move in lockstep. Different regions are experiencing different trends, and the Beige Book highlights those nuances.
Exactly. We talked about New York's housing market resilience, the Atlanta district's decline after Hurricane Helene, and the Richmond district's surprising rise in consumer spending. It's like getting a real-time economic snapshot from across the country.
Absolutely. These regional differences highlight the importance of looking beyond national statistics and understanding the local context. What's happening in one city might be completely different from what's happening in another.
Well said. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick pause here, but don't go anywhere. When we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the October 2024 Beige Book, exploring more insights and connecting the dots to help you understand what it all means for you. See you in a flash. We're back and ready to keep unraveling this economic puzzle with the Beige Book.
It's like each page we turn reveals another piece of the story.
Exactly. And this next piece takes us into the world of banking. How are things looking in that sector?
Well, the Beige Book says banking activity was generally steady to slightly up during this period.
So not a huge surge, but not a downturn either?
Right. And loan demand was mixed, meaning some businesses are borrowing while others are holding back.
Makes sense, given the overall uncertainty we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. But here's where it gets interesting. Some districts actually reported a more positive outlook for banking.
Really? Why is that?
They specifically cited declining interest rates as a reason for their optimism.
Ah, so that interest rate drop we discussed earlier is starting to have a positive impact.
It seems so. Lower interest rates can make borrowing more attractive for businesses, encouraging them to invest and potentially boosting economic activity.
Makes sense. It's all connected, isn't it?
It is. The economy is like a giant web with all these threads intertwined.
So what other threads or connections does the Beige Book reveal?
Well, one area that's particularly insightful is the link between inflation, wages, and consumer spending. We've already touched on how inflation is easing up.
Right, but it's still a concern for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And the Beige Book goes deeper, highlighting the continued pressure on something called input costs.
Input costs. You mean the expenses businesses have to pay just to operate and produce their goods or services?
Exactly. And these costs are still going up, although not as drastically as before, for many businesses.
So even though overall inflation is slowing down, businesses are still facing higher expenses.
That's right. And it puts them in a tough spot. They need to raise prices to cover their costs, but they also need to stay competitive, especially with consumers being so price-sensitive these days.
It's a real balancing act. The Beige Book specifically mentions things like rising insurance and healthcare costs as major pressures on businesses.
And those costs are tough to absorb. Have you noticed businesses in your area raising prices to cope with this, or are they finding other ways to manage?
It's a mix, to be honest. Some places have definitely raised prices, while others seem to be holding back for now. It's a trend worth watching for sure.
Definitely. It highlights how inflation isn't just this abstract concept. It has very real consequences for both businesses and consumers.
And it's not just about those big-ticket items like housing and healthcare, right? The Beige Book also mentions price increases for everyday things like groceries.
Absolutely. Food prices are a big one. When those go up, it really hits people's wallets.
It's like this chain reaction, isn't it? Higher input costs for businesses lead to higher prices for consumers, which then affects how people spend their money, and the cycle continues.
Exactly. It's a continuous loop, each element influencing the others. That's why understanding these connections is so important when trying to make sense of the economy.
So true. Now, shifting gears a bit, the Beige Book also gives us glimpses into specific sectors. One that caught my eye was the energy sector. What's happening there?
Well, the report indicates that energy activity was either unchanged or slightly down during this period.
So not a lot of movement there.
Not really. And a big factor driving this trend is the lower energy prices we've seen recently.
Right, which is good news for consumers filling up their tanks, but maybe not so good for energy producers.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword. Lower prices benefit consumers, but they can also impact energy companies' profits and investment decisions.
It's all about finding that balance, right?
Always. And it highlights the complex relationship between supply, demand, and prices within any industry.
Makes sense. Any other industries the Beige Book sheds light on?
Well, agriculture is one that stands out. We don't always think about it when discussing the overall economy, but it's obviously crucial.
That's true. It's easy to forget where our food comes from when we're focused on things like tech and manufacturing.
Right. But agriculture is a major player. It provides food, fiber, and fuel, and employs millions of people.
So what's the Beige Book saying about the state of agriculture?
The report indicates that agricultural activity was either flat or slightly down during this period. Some crop prices remain low, actually to the point where they're not profitable for many farmers.
So not a great time to be a farmer then.
It's a tough environment for sure. Low crop prices make it hard to cover costs, and that can ripple through the entire agricultural supply chain, potentially even impacting the prices we see at the grocery store.
It's a reminder that even in our technologically advanced world, we're still deeply connected to the land and the resources it provides.
Absolutely. And these insights into sectors like agriculture help us see how interconnected the economy truly is.
It's like we're zooming in and out, getting both the big picture and the close-up views of what's happening.
Exactly. And speaking of close-ups, I'm curious to hear more about what the Beige Book reveals about the human side of the economy. What's it saying about jobs, wages, and how people are feeling about their work?
That's a great point. We've talked about employment and wage trends, but the Beige Book goes deeper into those labor market dynamics.
Right. For instance, it highlights that even though employment is up slightly, Many businesses are still operating with lean staffing levels.
Lean staffing. You mean they're doing more with fewer employees?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be challenging for both employers and employees. Employers might struggle to keep up with demand or take on new projects, while employees might feel overworked and burned out.
It's about finding that sweet spot, isn't it? Meeting business needs without pushing employees too hard.
Definitely. And it's likely influencing wages as well. We talked about those modest wage increases, but the Beige Book suggests that improving worker availability is playing a role in keeping those increases moderate.
Right. We discussed that it's become easier to find workers in many districts.
Exactly. So when there's a larger pool of potential employees, it can put downward pressure on wages.
Supply and demand in action.
Precisely. But of course, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. We talked about how certain workers, like those with specialized skills or in remote areas, are still seeing bigger pay bumps.
Right. It's a mixed bag out there.
It is. And it highlights the need to consider those individual circumstances when we talk about wages. A one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't capture the nuances of the job market.
Well said. Now, beyond those numbers, I'm curious about the overall mood of the workforce. Are people feeling optimistic or pessimistic about their jobs and the economy?
That's a great question. The Beige Book doesn't directly measure worker sentiment, but it does offer some clues. For instance, it mentions that many businesses are still hesitant to make big hiring commitments.
Why is that?
They cite uncertainty about the future economic outlook as a major reason for their hesitation.
So even though we're seeing some job growth, there's still a sense of caution in the air?
Definitely. Businesses are taking a wait-and-see approach, holding back on major expansions or hiring sprees until they have a clearer picture of what lies ahead.
And I bet that cautious approach contributes to a feeling of unease among some workers, even those who have jobs. It's like this underlying anxiety about what the future holds.
Absolutely. When businesses aren't confident about the future, it can create a sense of job insecurity for everyone.
It's a reminder that the economy isn't just about numbers and statistics. It's about people's lives, their livelihoods, and their sense of well-being.
Precisely. And the Beige Book, with its real-life stories and observations, helps us connect those dots and understand the human impact of economic trends.
Well said. You know, as we've been going through this Beige Book, one theme keeps popping up. Uncertainty. It seems like everyone's feeling it right now.
It's definitely a major factor in the current economic climate.
Businesses are uncertain about the future outlook, consumers are uncertain about inflation and interest rates, and workers are uncertain about their job security. It's like this cloud hanging over everything.
That's a great way to put it. And that uncertainty can have a real impact on economic activity. When people feel uncertain, they tend to be more cautious with their spending, their investments, and their overall decision-making.
It's like a psychological barrier to growth.
Exactly. So how do we break through that barrier? I think clear communication and transparency are key.
What do you mean?
When policymakers, business leaders, and economic experts provide clear, consistent information about the economy and what they're doing to address the challenges, it can help ease uncertainty and boost confidence.
It's like providing a roadmap, helping people see the path ahead more clearly.
Exactly. And that's one of the roles the Beige Book plays. By offering this up-to-date, on-the-ground information, it helps us understand what's happening and why.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture trends, but what about some of those more subtle findings in the Beige Book? Are there any hidden gems we haven't uncovered yet?
Oh, there are always more insights to be found. The Beige Book is a rich source of information.
For example, the report mentions the impact of that short-lived dock workers' strike. We already discussed that it didn't cause major disruptions, but are there any deeper lessons to be learned from that event?
That's a great question. The Beige Book does offer some insights into the strike's ripple effects, even though they were limited. Some businesses did experience shipment delays, which could have affected their production or inventory.
So even a short disruption can have a cascading effect throughout the supply chain.
Exactly. It's a domino effect.
Yeah.
And it highlights how interconnected and fragile these systems can be.
And in this case, it emphasizes how vital those ports and transportation networks are to a smoothly functioning economy.
Absolutely. It's a reminder we shouldn't take those things for granted.
Now, going back to consumer spending for a minute, we talked about those mixed reports, but what's really driving those spending decisions? What's influencing how people are using their money?
Well, the Beige Book points to a few key factors. Inflation is a big one, of course. Even though it's moderating, people are still feeling the pinch, especially when it comes to those everyday essentials.
So even though prices aren't rising as fast as they were, people are still having to make tough choices about where to spend their money.
Exactly. And it's definitely changing their spending habits. The Beige Book notes that many consumers are becoming more price conscious, hunting for bargains, and cutting back on non-essential purchases.
Makes sense. When you're shelling out more for groceries and gas, you have less to spend on other things.
Exactly. And this shift is forcing businesses to adapt, too. They're having to rethink their pricing, their marketing, even their product offerings to cater to these more budget-conscious shoppers.
It's fascinating to see how all these economic forces play out in the real world.
Absolutely. And the Beige Book gives us that front row seat to those dynamics.
Now, besides inflation, what other factors are shaping consumer spending?
The labor market is a big one. We've talked about how employment is growing, but wage growth has been pretty modest. For a lot of people, their income simply isn't keeping up with the rising cost of living.
So even though more people are working, their paychecks aren't going as far.
That's the reality for many households, and it puts a real strain on their budgets. They're having to make tough choices, even if they feel relatively secure in their jobs.
It's a reminder that the economy isn't just about abstract numbers. It's about real people trying to make ends meet.
Precisely. And the Beige Book helps us see those real-life impacts.
You know, as we've been digging into this Beige Book, I'm struck by how resilient the economy seems to be. Despite all the challenges, there are also signs of strength and adaptability.
That's a great observation. Resilience is definitely a key theme that emerges from the Beige Book. Businesses are finding creative ways to adapt, workers are learning new skills, and communities are supporting those who are struggling.
It's a reminder that even in tough times, there's always hope and a drive to keep moving forward.
Absolutely. And that resilience gives me optimism for the future. Even though we face big challenges, I believe we can overcome them and create a more prosperous and equitable economy for everyone.
I love that positive outlook.
We do. The Beige Book reminds us that the economy isn't just about cold, hard numbers. It's a reflection of our collective efforts, our creativity, and our potential.
Beautifully said. Okay, folks, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the October 2024 Beige Book and explore what it all means for you. Stay tuned. And we're back for the final leg of our Beige Book journey. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have. Manufacturing, housing, jobs, inflation, that ever-present uncertainty. It's been quite the ride.
It has, but through it all, the Beige Book has given us some really valuable insights.
Definitely. And as we wrap up, I think it's worth emphasizing one key takeaway, the importance of regional variations.
Right. The U.S. economy isn't a single entity. It's a tapestry of different regions, each with its own unique story to tell.
Exactly. And the Beige Book captures those regional nuances beautifully.
It does. Like we discussed earlier, the New York housing market is holding strong, the Atlanta district is facing challenges after Hurricane Helene, and the Richmond district is seeing a surprising rise in consumer spending.
It's a great reminder that national statistics only tell part of the story. We need to zoom in and understand how different communities are experiencing these trends on the ground.
So true. It's about connecting those big picture trends to the real life experiences of people in different parts of the country.
Precisely. And that's what makes the Beige Book such a valuable resource. It's not just about abstract numbers, it's about real people. Real businesses and the real challenges and opportunities they face in their communities.
Okay, so as we bring this deep dive to a close, I'm curious to hear your expert perspective. What are the key takeaways from this Beige Book? What are the big picture trends we should all be paying attention to?
That's a great question. If I had to boil it down to a few key takeaways, I'd say first, the U.S. economy is in a state of flux. We're not seeing huge swings in either direction, but there's this sense of cautious optimism tempered by uncertainty about the future.
A cautious dance, you might say.
Exactly. Second, inflation is cooling down, which is encouraging, but it's still a concern for both businesses and consumers.
Right. We've been talking about how those input costs are still rising for businesses, and consumers are feeling the pinch at the grocery store.
Exactly. So businesses have to adapt, find that balance between covering their costs and staying competitive.
The tough spot to be in, for sure. Okay, what else?
Third, the labor market is relatively strong, unemployment is low, and wages are growing, although at a rather modest pace.
But we talked about how that wage growth isn't keeping up with inflation for a lot of workers. And there's that persistent skills gap, making it hard for businesses to find workers with the specific skills they need.
Right. Those are definitely challenges that need to be addressed. And finally, those regional variations are significant. The U.S. economy isn't a one-size-fits-all system, And different regions are experiencing these trends in very different ways.
So it's crucial to consider those local nuances when we're trying to understand the bigger picture.
Absolutely. All right, so those are some of the key takeaways from the Beige book.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean moving forward? What are the implications of these trends for the economy in the coming months?
Ah, yes, the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, the Beige book doesn't come with a crystal ball. It can offer clues and insights, but predicting the future with any certainty is, well, impossible.
It is. But based on what we've learned, what are your thoughts on what we might expect in the coming months? Any guesses about the economic road ahead?
Hmm. Well, I think it's safe to say that we're likely in for a continued period of uncertainty. The global economic landscape is incredibly complex, and there are so many factors at play right now.
So many factors. We've got the ongoing war in Ukraine, which continues to disrupt global energy markets and supply chains. We've got the lingering effects of the pandemic still rippling through certain industries and labor markets. And of course, there's the ever-present uncertainty around inflation and interest rates.
Right. It's almost like trying to predict the weather patterns in a hurricane season.
It is. A lot of swirling forces with the potential to shift things dramatically. So yeah, uncertainty is the name of the game.
But even with all that uncertainty, are there any reasons to be optimistic? Or are we headed for a gloomy economic winter?
Well, I definitely wouldn't say we're headed for a gloomy winter. I see reasons for optimism, too. Amidst all this uncertainty, I also see signs of resilience and adaptability. Businesses are finding ways to innovate and overcome these challenges. Workers are acquiring new skills and exploring different opportunities. And hopefully policymakers are working to address those underlying structural issues that contribute to economic instability.
That's a much brighter outlook. I like it. So, what advice would you give to our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this and figure out what it means for their own lives?
My advice would be to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay adaptable. Informed means keeping up with reliable economic news and analysis. Don't just skim the headlines, dig deeper, understand the nuances. Engaged means participating in the economic and political processes that shape our world. Vote, advocate, have informed discussions with your family and friends. And adaptable means being willing to adjust your plans and expectations as the economic landscape shifts.
Love that. Be informed, be engaged, be adaptable. It's about being proactive rather than letting the uncertainty paralyze us.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating complex situations like this.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the October 2024 Beige book, what's the one thought-provoking question you want to leave our listeners with? Something to ponder as they go about their day.
Given all these trends and knowing that predicting the future is always a bit of a gamble, what are your predictions for the economy in the coming months? What opportunities or challenges do you see on the horizon? Think about it. Let us know.
That's a great question to ponder. And remember, folks, you can always explore the Beige book on your own. We'll provide a link to the full report in the show notes.
It's a fascinating read, full of insights and anecdotes that really bring the economy to life.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the economic tea leaves.
It's been a pleasure.
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
I will.
Until next time.